Welcome to Speaking of Service, the podcast that uncovers practical ways to grow service revenue, control costs, and improve customer satisfaction. If you're looking to innovate, gain a competitive edge, or just learn about the latest service trends, you've come to the right place. Today, Chris Wolf joins two service experts, Anthony Maffa and Sumir Dutta from PTC. They dive deep into the world of field service and speak about the importance of reevaluating service in our digital world.
It's no mean feat to elevate your field services game, especially when revenue, profit, and stakeholder ownership is at stake. Today, we're going to deep dive into the world of field service excellence, machine wellness, and customer value. We'll explore transformative mindsets, practical strategies, and real-life examples that empower field service professionals in our ever-evolving marketplace. As human beings, shifting from a mindset of treating sickness to embracing wellness is really a change in mindset at its core. And we believe that the same thing is true when it comes to machine service. We've traditionally thought about fixing sick machines or, looking after downtime. But service professionals today are thinking from a wellness perspective. I have two guests with me who are experts in that shifting mindset. Sumir, welcome to Speaking of Service.
Good to be here, Wolfie.
Welcome back, Anthony.
Thank you, Wolfie. Good to be here again.
Love for you guys to just introduce yourselves professionally and tell us a little bit about how you come to this topic of machine wellness. So, Sumir, let's talk with you first.
Sure. Yeah, I'm the VP of Product Marketing for the Service Lifecycle Management business here at PTC.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome to the family.
Well, it's good to be here. And I've actually studied the topic of service and service lifecycle and field service for approximately 20 years now. Used to do it as an analyst for the Aberdeen Group and then the Service Council. So I wrote about best practices in service and field service. And then I actually put some of those practices into action when I joined ServiceMax in their global customer transformation business and then moved to product marketing. We're trying to tell better stories around the products that we build at ServiceMax and now at PTC from a service perspective, and what those products mean from a business value to the community of service leaders that we serve. So the topic of service and the expanding definition of service, I think it's something that we've been talking about for quite some time, but we see this is a pivotal moment, to be honest. Service leaders, we like to call them chief service officers. They might not have that title, but they should. They've always been given credit for the relationship with the customer. But I think organizations are beginning to realize they have a relationship with the asset or the product that's being serviced that is very, very important, especially when we consider the data that comes from that asset and what can be done with that data. So the expanded view of service that we're talking about, that service leaders that we're speaking to are talking about, is considering and moving service away from a very transactional point of time. We need to fix something to what you said, to understanding the life cycle of the asset, all the way from the moment it leaves the shop to a point of operation, so commissioning, installation, all the way down to end of life, and all of the different touch points that impact that life cycle of the asset. So that's a slightly different pivot to service as opposed to break-fix service, field service. It's really all of the different touch points in the life cycle of that asset.
I'm thinking about, so many software companies like us are putting an emphasis on customer success, but this is almost like applying a machine success extension to that. Anthony, what's your perspective?
Well, coming from a background of being the service provider, Sumir actually, and I go back a long way. I was one of the people Sumir would talk to and interview about the process of what we were doing in service. And what we noticed, and it kind of dovetails into what Sumir's saying, is we need to get service away from being transactional, right? Where we're looked at as just as the person who comes in with the bandages and the triage kit to fix the problem. We need to be more proactive in the process. And so that as a service organization, you entrust me and my network to be part of your organization, to enhance the performance of your organization, as opposed to, well, we're just the last people you call when there's a problem, when something's down. Right? And there's in this world we're in today, particularly now that we're becoming more integrated, not just as a sharing data, but we've become integrated as an organization, ServiceMax coming into the PTC family, we start to add more to the table of I can give people in the field more information in real time to be more effective and efficient in that process.
Well, with our acquisition of ServiceMax, we'd be remiss not to talk about how service is getting that elevated attention here at PTC the way it is in our customer base. I mean, Neil Barua came to us from ServiceMax and is now our CEO. We cut our teeth in CAD and PLM engineering and then in manufacturing. But maybe each of you could speak a little bit about how service is becoming a crown jewel in the crown at PTC.
Yeah, I think PTC has recognized for quite some time and invested significantly in sort of the value of service. But to the point that we were just making about, it's not just about the relationship with the customer. I think that's equally valuable, but it's the relationship with that asset. And given that we're at this pivotal juncture when it comes to industrial digital transformations, I know the word digital transformation gets used, but when you think about industrial digital transformations, there's a premium on line of sight into the entire product and asset, all the way from when it is designed to then when it goes into operations. And what tends to happen is companies lose that line of sight. They typically get the design stage and they lose that line of sight, and once that asset is out because it was sold by a partner or was sold by someone else, they no longer have visibility into that product. There is a recognition that that relationship with the asset that service holds, which is captured in systems like ServiceMax or captured through platforms like IIoT and ThingWorks, that line of sight can be very, very valuable, essentially from a bigger, broader picture decision-making. You talked about sort of asset lifecycle. It's the asset lifetime value. And, what is the decision that needs to be made on that asset? Is it a replacement? Is it a maintenance? Is it a repair? When does that need to happen? Anthony talked about predictive and proactive. Do you do it now? Do you do it later? Do you do it after it breaks? Who's going to do that? How is it going to be done? Is it going to be done remotely? Is it going to be done by a field technician? Is it going to be done by someone in a depot? And then what is the reason for that? Understanding the cost of that decision, and is it a repair or a replacement decision? And so these optimization strategies at the asset level can only happen when you have that data and that expansive view of service, which now ServiceMax brings into the PTC portfolio, along with all of the other assets like Servigistics and ThingWorks and the capabilities built in.
It's really a technology-led inflection point, right, Anthony? All the right capabilities kind of coming together and gelling to enable this wellness mindset.
It is, and if you think about when we ask people what they need in a product, right? We talk about the voice of the customer. Sometimes in Six Sigma, we'll talk about the voice of the process. This is the voice of the product, is what we're really talking about now, and getting that information. And the more you chronicle about a device, whether that is my interaction with that device to repair it, or it's the data coming from that device in its real-time operation, the more we know about what's been done to it, how it's been done, who did it, when it was done, and what it's doing, the more likely we're going to have a very well thought out resolution to both service, repair, long-term maintenance, even decommissioning of an asset. When is it necessarily time to do that? Because if you keep seeing the same problem, you're like, all right, it's time to actually move forward with this. Look at the life cycle of a product today. For most of the things we're talking about, we're not talking about iPhones, right? We're not talking about a cell phone that has a 2 to 3 year consumer-based life. We're talking about things that have 15 to 20 to 30 years life in the field. So maintenance is absolutely going to happen on it. And very often, if you look at some of the studies, it's anywhere from 6 to 15 times the revenue generated in service that was actually generated in the product sale. So all of those things combined really are starting to say the source of revenue for these organizations to grow and move forward is really coming from service more so than the product development itself.
So interesting. Anthony made the point, but maybe you could just clarify this a little bit more, Samir. We're talking about capital-intensive, large, complex, enormous pieces of equipment. Maybe you could characterize some of the types of equipment that we're discussing.
Yeah, the machines, when we think about machines as high value or complex equipment, so typically the simplest way to think about them is there's a premium or a significant value erosion if they are down, if they are not operating. So if you think about a medical device, a piece of equipment, the impact of that equipment not being ready and operational. Industrial manufacturing, if the plant floor or shop floor needs to shut down because of poor maintenance, things don't get produced. We have discussions around the aerospace and defense. You have engines, things that are highly, highly operational, need to be fine-tuned. So there's a downstream impact to them not operating. So that's one way to look at it. The second thing, there's a complexity to repairing and maintaining them, which requires instructions, requires parts, requires data. It's not just a standard swap out to maybe what you would consider in a more consumer setting, which is just something's not working, I'm going to give you a different one. Here, there's a little bit more premium to fixing that product or maintaining that product with a set of instructions, set of parts, and a set of information about what needs to be done on that. The only other thing I would want to add to that from an informational point of view, we're talking a lot about operational decisions that need to be made. Anthony brought out a really good point around there's a really big commercial aspect to these decisions around, are you covered by a service contract? What are the parts that you need to be purchasing? And that's where we're also beginning to see this elevation of the discussion around services. It's not just about making the right decision that's operationally for you as a business from a profitability point of view or for your customer, but it's also what are the commercial elements, what are the commercial hooks that you can have to, one, of course, continue to deliver value to that customer, but then create more revenue opportunities for pull-through for your service business, whether it's contracts or it's parts or additional services, or the revenue contribution to your entire business. Mr. and Mrs. Customer, you're operating at 99% utilization. Perhaps you need another piece of equipment or the upgraded version of the equipment. It changes the dynamic on the conversation with the customer to, if you understand the value prop of how they're using your equipment, to what else they should be utilizing from your organization. And service can open that door once you recognize that bigger picture view of service.
Well, you're really tapping into the mindset of every discipline in a machine maker. You've got R&D and engineering who dream up advanced features and differentiation for their machine. You've got the marketing organization who brings the good news of those features to the marketplace. You've got manufacturing that produces that and rolls off the line. But now we're talking about elevating what has for decades been a break-fix function up into the boardroom, the C-suite, and convincing people to trust data as opposed to the machine whisperers who've been out in the field. How do you get organizations to make that mindset shift? And if I looked at a normal distribution of users and customers in this space, where's the middle? Are we at the peak of enlightenment? Are we the trough of disillusionment? Where are we on that curve?
It's a really good question. We're still very early in that. I think there's a recognition of, to your point, the trust in the data, and establishing that trust in data can be extremely valuable. I think the actions on that data are still siloed, and I think there's a significant opportunity for customers to begin to bring together these different silos of data for better decision-making for themselves as businesses, but also for their customers. And I think we're at a transformative time when it comes to, because everyone's talking about AI, and everyone wants to get value from what AI can bring. And I think there's many different versions and disciplines of AI. I think traditionally everyone's focused on sort of the machine learning components of it and the algorithms, and it's been relevant in service around parts and scheduling optimization. I think where we are now is, how can you apply AI to incomplete information? And so you get incomplete results. And so we've got to fix our data and our data trust issues before we can truly magnify AI is one view of it. But a second view with the newer advancements in AI around Gen AI is, can AI actually help you take unstructured content and service? Service is a very unstructured base. You've got technician notes, you've got customer notes, you've got call records. And you actually apply some of the tools that are available today to now pull that into an insight, into a customer data platform, an asset data platform, an asset system of record, if you will, and build that complete picture. And I think it's going to be one of those levers that drives companies from, we're still going to look at data in silos, to we need to look at this from a bigger picture, Engineering can benefit from service data, service can benefit from engineering data, manufacturing can benefit all around, and ultimately the value proposition is to the customer.
Anthony, we see a lot of AI washing, and many of our customers have moved into machine learning, and they say, you know, ain't I AI? What are you seeing in the field at a pragmatic level?
Well, I'm seeing a little bit of in the past year, it's been an explosion in terms of everywhere, in every conference we go to, AI is predominantly displayed. But I think there's a bit of a disingenuous presentation of that content. And what I mean by that is people are leveraging the generative discussions to imply that they maybe have generative capabilities in their environment. And the challenge with this is the vast majority are dealing with rules-based or machine learning techniques, which is fine, which is absolutely applicable to the environment we're in, but it's really not the generative. So I think what I'm finding is customers are expecting a generative solution is available to them today, when the reality is they don't know enough about their process, the physics that govern the process, the data that's coming from their machines, or even the sensorization might be imperfect on their equipment to do that level of intellectual prediction, right? So that's really what the machine's doing. It's saying, hey, based on all the data I have, this is what's going on. And the reality is, what we're saying is, I need to have my intelligence from either my R&D team or my service team, or the combination of those two, to combine what we see in the field, to combine the data that we get from the machine, to determine how that machine may fail in the future. Then we can model it. So I see that kind of a chasm there, where people think we have generative, and the reality is where we are is more machine learning. But I wanted to actually go back a little bit, and I think the challenge that we have is that engineering often looks at service as not their peer, but their subordinate in the process. Now, I don't want to say that in terms of everybody works in that way falsely. The reason I say this is the engineering team, what I found in practice was when we took them into the field to see what service did, they had a greater appreciation for the way the equipment was used. And it actually brought some level of agreement between the two parties as to what was going on. To Sameer's point, when you have that level of data from the technician notes and the IoT data and so on, and you can present that concisely and succinctly to the R&D department, then you're in that better position, because it's too expensive to take every engineer to the field. But now we have the opportunity to take the field to the engineer.
I've got to imagine the circular economy and sustainability is an accelerant for this, because engineers are going to have to think about how machines behave in the field, and then, how do we reap what's valuable of that machine when it comes back off the field? Are you seeing that happening in the real world?
We're absolutely having customers coming to us now that want to know how much energy their piece of equipment is consuming. We have other service customers who are concerned about reducing truck rolls, because then they can report that before I used to do 1,000 truck rolls a week, and now I'm doing 700. So my carbon footprint has decreased. They want to expand their business. Well, in the conventional model of the world, expanding my service business, if I don't deploy technology, means I expand the number of technicians I have. So if I expand business without technology, I expand my carbon footprint. So they're starting to take all that into consideration, and they're looking at this from a sustainability perspective. Now, it's the R&D teams that are more concerned about what can I recoup from that. But to your point earlier, if we don't give them the data on performance and what's happening in that field, they have no idea, right? That is a lost, it's data right now that is, analysts refer to as dark data. If I don't connect to a thing and pull that information, it's data nobody has access to. So it's dark data that we have no visibility into. So we're really unearthing that dark data, and you can turn that into actionable intelligence.
I think there's going to be a couple of triggers that will get this sort of one bigger picture of service programmatized within an organization, but also an organization to start thinking about, it's not just engineering data, manufacturing data, and service data, but all of this is data, whether it's the asset or the product or it's the customer. The circular economy and sustainability could be one of those. We're beginning to see more of an uptake, as Anthony mentioned, companies thinking about it from not only how they're looking at technology, but how they're thinking about the life cycle of their products. There are regulations and regulatory pushes to go that way. We're seeing a lot more in Europe compared to North America. There's mandates now where companies have to report on sort of their footprint and the life cycle of sort of from a carbon point of view and beyond that. There's a lot more that's coming down the pipe to say not only do you need to measure and track, but now you need to report on these things, which becomes really a push and a driver for companies to go down that path. And to me, when I think about it, and we haven't seen this at the service level yet, if I ask the question, as a service leader, are you being pushed by sustainability mandates? Perhaps not currently directly, but it is at the executive level because they're reporting on this. It kind of brings that extended picture of service into the focus, because if you start the discussion of service at the engineering and design level, and you think about how you're designing for serviceability, sustainability, even maybe profitability, you're thinking about, maybe I should design this in a way that it could be fixed remotely, or a customer could fix it so we don't have to do the truck rolls, if you will. But then the other ways to thinking about it is, how is it being operated? What's the energy usage? What's the energy footprint? What's my supply chain in the support of this? What's the shipping cost? There's a big footprint. And then the ultimate thing when you think about circularity, which is the reuse and the repurposing and the recycling of the asset, what components of that am I going to repair and refurbish and actually put out there versus the purchase of a net new asset? So it kind of brings these disciplines of service, to what you pointed out originally as a break-fix service, which is now service as a discipline has become, you've got asset management, you've got inventory management, you've got some of the monetization elements. But then you also have this concept of intelligence and information that starts at the engineering world and then goes through the entire life cycle of the asset. So it's sort of circularity, or the circular economy or sustainability, could be one of those drivers that really brings this bigger picture of service into focus.
It's easy, I think, to talk about service at this desk in kind of an ivory tower mentality, but the truck roll and the person with tools is real. We have a population of highly skilled and experienced professionals who will be moving out of the service delivery marketplace, and we hope an influx of talent to backfill that experience. But there's kind of a brackish water thing that's happening right now, where we have a mix of both of those. What are our clients asking for in terms of capability to enable the day in the life of the service technician?
Do you want to go first?
Wow, that is a loaded question. They're asking for everything. They're challenged, to your point, the silver tsunami, as it's been called, right? They're challenged with that level of experience leaving the organization. And obviously, they want to retain that experience. And I think you can leverage some of the tools that we have today to do that, right? You can leverage, for example, oddly enough, IoT, because you can keep some of your senior technicians on in a remote capacity. They work maybe 10 to 20 hours a week, right? They're accessible as a super tech, for example. Phone a friend, hey, I got a problem and I need some help. So that makes it accessible to them, because rather than having to be on site to see what's going on, they have the remote eyes to see what's going on. We certainly have other tools like our Vuforia and AR experiences where you can capture that information from them. And so they're your digital mentor or your coach that you can bring along with you and access anytime you want. So they certainly are looking for things like that. But honestly, they're a bit miffed, because the difference in the technicians coming out of the field is it's very big chasm between what they were used to in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's not because the intellect is different, it's because the products are different today than they were 30 or 40 years ago. So 30 or 40 years ago, the technicians knew how to use multimeters. They knew how to half a circuit. They could desolder and solder in new components because that was the job that they did. Today, we don't do that. Today, it's more analytics in the equipment, and it's replacing a board or replacing a power supply as opposed to replacing. So the mindset of the technician is changing too. And I think that's where they're struggling, because there's a lot of them that are used to the old operating mentality, and they're not quite sure how to make it work with the new operating mentality and the new technician who comes in who has a different way of looking at the world.
Well, they're also having to service an equally heterogeneous set of devices, assets out in the field. Some that were born into the old world and some that were born into this new world.
I just wanted to add on the topic of the technician, the engineer. At ServiceMax, we used to do technician ride-alongs. It was part of what we were requested to do once a year. And it's eye-opening when you sit with you talked about engineering sitting with the technicians. If you're in the business of software and you actually see your software being used, it is very eye-opening in terms of how the technician interacts with that software and how they interact with the work that they do. I've also been part of research that's been done by the Service Council around like the voice of that field service engineer. And if you ever ask the technicians, like, what's the biggest pain point in your day-to-day life? The number one thing they'll say is the time spent looking for information. We have the tools, we have the capabilities, the information exists in multiple formats, but it's the time spent looking for that. And typically, if that's not accessible in a way, shape, or form, or the technician isn't prepared with that, they're going to phone a friend. They're going to go through that whole process of trying to figure it out because they want to solve the customer's problems. There used to be a mindset of, to make the technicians more efficient, we're just going to schedule them better. We're going to give them that additional 1 minute of reduced drive time. And I think the mindset has shifted to, the 1 minute of drive time that was saved, they still ended up doing 30 minutes of information search because they didn't know where the key to the door was, or they didn't know, so it's really it shifted more so about what are technicians spending their time on when on site, and how can we potentially help them so that most of that time is spent in front of the machine, in front of the customer, and potentially generating revenue for the business. So that's a little bit of a change in mindset is how can we remove some of the frustrations, whether that's information search or administrative tasks from a technician productivity point of view. The other thing, and I think the view on this is that we don't find that there will be a one-to-one replacement in the talent pool. I think there's just a skill set that's going to depart and a knowledge set that's going to depart that will not be replaced by the next generation. And some of the things, Anthony, you talked about from a technology point of view will fill that gap. I think organizations are beginning to look at, instead of the number of technicians leaving, the capacity of those technicians. And how can that capacity be met by, we would call this the concept of the connected worker, but how can that capacity be met by different people within the organization? So some of it needs to be done by the technician, but there's actually a whole bunch of work that can be done by, let's say, remote support agents. These might be the super techs that you talked about that just sit and do multiple sessions when guiding technicians or guiding customers. And then there's more work that can be done that's self-service. So I think if technicians were doing, let's just say 20 jobs, do all 20 of them actually require a field dispatch, or can some of them be done by a customer? Can some of them be done by a customer service team? Could some of them be done by a remote agent? And then ultimately, if you need that technician, let's make sure that they're going there to do the right work. And if there's other work that they need to do, we're doing it once. So I think the mindset on capacity is we're not going to replace technicians one for one. We're not going to replace them necessarily with technology, so it's not where that's going, but it's really about how do you look at the entirety of your service organization and ecosystem and replace that capacity with all of these different modes of service.
Some of our earlier guests have talked about the challenge of selling the valuable of the intangible wellness of a machine. So many, was the Maytag repairman who everybody thought was the greatest guy, but he was the most lonely guy because he was never out on the road. So many of our customers talk about their end customer really having a relationship with the machine whisperer who comes out on site, and they pick that person's brain for lots of other pieces. How are service business models evolving to address this question of wellness as opposed to rapid response to sickness?
Well, back in the day of being in the service business, there was a love-hate relationship with my technician having a good rapport with the customer. And the reason I say love-hate is I love the fact that they had the rapport because the customer entrusted us. The hate part of that was it meant you were seeing the customer too often, right? So I don't want you to see them all the time because that means we're dispatching all the time to your location, that you have problems, and what we would like to have is a regular cadence with you and maintain that relationship. And I think this is where we get into, as you draw the corollary to health and maintaining my own personal health. A doctor looks at my family history. He looks at my records over time, because I've changed doctors over the years, but they have that historical reference to who I am and what makes me tick and the things that I need as a human being. And it's exactly the same scenario in the machine world when we have that confluence of data about the design of it and the parts that were needed on it and the service history through ServiceMax and the stethoscope, so to speak, that I get from IoT, right? I'm listening to all those different machine content. That is such a strong corollary that it makes sense to the service organization. They start to understand it's exactly what I'm doing in my day-to-day life with my own personal health. Why wouldn't I do it at the machine level?
So thank you guys for being with us here today. Maybe I could ask you each to come up with 2 takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with.
So I do have 2. I told Samira earlier, we were talking, and it kind of reminded me of one thing. One of the first things I always tell people that this is a maturation process. This is not a destination. You just don't say, I'm going to get to this level of service. I need to build out and learn as I go along. And what that means is I'm going to make decisions, and I might have to pivot slightly on those decisions. So we will constantly have to look at that, reevaluate where we are. In Six Sigma, there's a term that says shift happens. And in a multivariate world, that's what happens. You can fix one problem, but a different factor changes, and we're back into an issue. So you can never assume that the problem is solved. It's really a very strong essence of AI, right? AI lives in that world. It always changes. The second thing that I've learned over the years is that while it may cost me the same amount of money to dispatch a technician on Monday as it does to do it on Friday, it's a world of difference to my customer, right? And the customer is the one who is expecting uptime and needs that SLA met because you're disrupting their business. So what we're really doing here in this is something that our service customers should be selling to their end customers is we're bringing that in and we're saying we're going to get to you as soon as we can. We're going to make sure that our SLAs are met because we understand that our performance is your business.
Anthony stole my 2.
He'll do that.
I think there's a couple of things that if I were speaking to a service leader, the 2 things I would ask them to do. One is, and Anthony talked about this a little bit, there's a customer experience that's delivered by your service organization and primarily by your service professionals, whether they're in the back office, on the front. And it's very, very important to keep a fine eye on what it is that the customer is looking for and demanding. Now, some people will say customer experience means we need to create a portal or we need to do certain things. Ultimately, customers want one of 2 things. They want, one, they don't want that product or asset that they rely on breaking. But if it does break, they want to be in the know of what's happening and how they're being informed around it and how the impact of that can be minimized. And I think sometimes customer organizations forget about that in the whole service experiences, keeping the customer in the middle of that journey. We talked about one of the changing dynamics. It could be sustainability, it could be AI. At some point, customers will pivot. It's not happened yet, but at some point, customers will pivot as a buying group to saying, we don't want to buy service and we don't want to buy equipment separately. We want to buy the outcome that this generates. So the responsibility of that equipment running goes away from us as a customer to you as an organization because we're trusting you as the designer and the builder of that equipment and the maintainer of that equipment to deliver the outcomes, and we'll pay for the outcomes. If we use it more, if it's more reliable, we'll pay more. That hasn't happened yet. I mean, people call it servitization or equipment as a service. It's happening in pockets, but we haven't seen a wide shift to that. At some point, the customer will become more and more relevant and demand that as an outcome. And they will demand a much more consumer experience. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss that wave. I think that's the first recommendation is listen to your customers and be perhaps more mindful of what they're expressing and what they perhaps aren't expressing, which is they need to get more value from the products that they buy, whether that's in a lower operations or maintenance cost or a better outcome for the same cost that they have. That's a big recommendation. The second one I think is, And however you might do this as a service leader or as a business leader, it doesn't need to be very integrated. It doesn't need to be very programmatized. But as long as you can start, and I'd say start with two individuals. One is your sales teams, and then or sales leadership and sales teams. And the second would be, let's just say from an engineering point of view or quality, just start the conversation around what you're seeing from a data perspective. What are the opportunities? Sales, of course, more commercial opportunities, they'll jump on it, whether that's a renewal, an upsell, cross-sell, new equipment. And then from a product engineering, product management perspective, quality issues, reliability issues. Of course, there's requirements from a regulation point of view. But understanding what they're going through, because those folks are compensated by getting things out the door from an NPI process, and they don't want to spend that much time supporting that, and they don't want to do that, but they want better data. Just start the conversation. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just start that conversation about what the service data is sharing with you, and then eventually you could put in those commercial organizations or those service engineering organizations that could drive your business forward.
Well, guys, I can't thank you enough for the conversation. A listener, if you're with me, I've been thinking a lot about this shift from a transactional subscription SLA-based approach to service towards one that's much more focused on success and meeting business outcomes. I invite you to reach out to us. We'll put the gentleman's contact info right here on our website. We'd love to continue the conversation with you in person or virtually. Reach out to us, and thanks for joining Speaking of Service.
Thanks for listening to the Speaking of Service podcast, brought to you by PTC. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a rating or review. And be sure to check out other episodes to hear new perspectives on improving life for aftermarket professionals, service teams, and the customers they support. If you have a topic of interest or want to provide feedback, email us at speakingofservice@ptc.com or visit us at ptc.com/speakingofservice.